It's crazy to think that nearly 3 decades have passed since the release of the original PlayStation. I don't know about you, but that makes me feel old. There have been some major advances since we last took a look at the console's evolution, so I figured it's time we followed suit with an all-in-one update.
Or a burden too heavy to bear.
Remember this. You are not alone.
So, let's see how PlayStation evolved over the years and revolutionized the gaming industry. This is the evolution of PlayStation. As huge as Sony's PlayStation is nowadays, it may not have existed at all if it weren't for the decision of another gaming giant, Nintendo. That's because originally Sony were reluctant to build their own gaming machine and instead worked with other companies, like Nintendo, to create add-ons for existing products. For example, in 1988, Sony helped to build a CD-ROM version of Nintendo's hugely popular SNES. The resulting console was unveiled in 1991 and was called the PlayStation. However, just one day after its announcement, Nintendo broke its partnership deal with Sony and opted to team up with Philips instead. Sony's president, Norio Oga, was furious in response to this rejection and tasked Ken Kutaragi with developing the PlayStation into a machine that would compete with Nintendo's. In December 1994, the new PlayStation was born. Released in Japan to begin with, the console was a roaring success and would be distributed to a worldwide audience 1 year later. It cost $299 at launch and went on to become the first game console in history to sell more than 100 million units. The PlayStation's main advantage over the competition was that it used CD for all of its games, as opposed to the heavy use of cartridges at the time. Whereas a cartridge could store maybe 12 to 15 megabytes of data, developers using CD could store up to 650 megabytes. A memory card containing 128 kilobytes of storage was required to save your game progress. The PlayStation's superior specifications meant better graphics and an overall improved gameplay experience. As a result, established franchises like Final Fantasy actually switched from Nintendo to PlayStation. Classic games like Ridge Racer, Crash Bandicoot, and Metal Gear Solid also attracted a wide audience and showcased the amazing performance of the console. As for PlayStation's best-selling game, that would be Gran Turismo, of course. Gran Turismo was incredibly difficult to develop. Game designer Kazunori Yamachi said, quote, "It took 5 years. In those 5 years, we could not see the end. I would wake up at work, go to sleep at work. It was getting cold, so I knew it must be winter. I estimate I was home only 4 days a year." All the hard work resulted in groundbreaking graphics, and it is considered one of the greatest video games of all time. It was also a huge financial success, with over 10.9 million copies sold. Gran Turismo has become a huge series since its debut in 1997. The latest game in the series is Gran Turismo 7, which was released on March 4th, 2022. It's mind-blowing to see how much graphics have evolved in 25 years. Sony's machine was pretty impressive as a music CD player too. It played discs with great clarity, and as such, it served multiple uses, appealing to both families and older generations. This tradition of dual purpose would be seen in later versions of PlayStation, with the PS2 catering to DVDs and the PS3 serving as one of the cheapest Blu-ray players upon its release. Sony spent a long time making sure the PlayStation controller was comfortable and reflected the 3D aspect of its games, too. The increased thickness of the controller in comparison to other consoles of the era, and even the PlayStation's 3D logo design, were in reference to this. Clearly inspired by the controller used on Nintendo's NES system, the PlayStation controller added shoulder buttons to allow gamers more in-play options, plus handles for better grip. Rather than assigning letters to each button, the iconic square, triangle, circle, and cross symbols were introduced. What's more, these symbols actually mean something too. The triangle refers to a viewpoint, and the direction a player is headed. The square button indicates a piece of paper, acting as the game's menu, and the circle and X buttons mean yes and no, respectively, even though they are rarely used for their intended purposes in games nowadays. The shapes are still seen on modern controllers and are closely linked to PlayStation's brand image. Sony's attention to detail has always been impressive. To ensure their PlayStation controller wasn't too heavy, it was tested by gamers in all sorts of positions, including lying down. When it was released in North America, the controllers were made 10% larger than the ones used in Japan, because most Americans' hands were bigger than those of the Japanese. To give players a better range of motion in 3D environments, Sony created the dual analog controller in 1996, adding 2 analog sticks, which were revolutionary at the time. With the release of the new controller came 2 analog-capable titles, Tobal 2 and Bushido Blade. 1 year later, Sony introduced the DualShock controller, which featured rumble support. That meant that the dual analog controller could now vibrate, adding an extra dimension and increased immersiveness for gamers.